Meanwhile, I'd taken up a position behind my vehicle and was using a machine gun to fend off advancing infantry. A platoon of German infantry could be seen a couple of 100 yards away, advancing on our position. The carrier was on fire, and ammunition was getting low. I waited a few seconds until the German platoon had passed a gap in the hedge, and then gave them a full blast of machine gun fire. They faltered, and I shouted to my trapped colleague to get out of the carrier.
And then suddenly I heard a rumbling coming up through the next hedge, and that was a Tiger tank coming through the hedge with his gun pointing straight at me. So I dived on the ground, dead flat on the face, and he fired an armour-piercing shell which went right through my carrier, and it sprayed my backside with old bit splinters like a lot of red-hot needles as it went through. When I got back to the unit, I reported to the medics I was wounded, and they said, "Oh, drop your trousers, bend over," and they got tweezers and they pulled out lots of these little bits, slapped me on the back and said, "Fit pretty easy." And that was the end of my July the 10th, 1944.
I was on 112, yes.
Hill 112.
Hill 112.
Point 112.
112.
Hill 112.
Hill 112.
Hill 112 area.
Have you heard of Hill 112?
Yes.
Yeah. So we were involved for up to, I think, 6 weeks around Hill 112. It was just after Epsom, that's when the division was given the real task of trying to take Hill 112. You know the stories about Hill 112, I expect.
What are your own memories of it?
Well, it was quite frightening, really.
Focusing on the battle for Hill 112, this video explores a series of scenarios that chronicle the intense fight to secure this strategic position on July 10th, 1944. To understand the upcoming struggle for Hill 112, it's worth going back slightly further though. Before this operation, the area had witnessed fierce fighting for control, with the pivotal Operation Epsom marking the first Allied capture of the hill, albeit at the high watermark of their advance. Illustrating the front lines established during Operation Epsom, here we see the peak of the Allied push. However, to gain a clearer picture of the situation on the ground, we can look at this map. It shows the approximate locations of various units for the evening of June 29th, before the attack of 2 SS Panzer Corps. These ink blots highlight the scattered nature of the British positions, in contrast to the defined lines of the previous map. Looking at the gaps here, the uncertainties become more apparent, offering a glimpse into the precarious situation that ultimately led to the British withdrawal from Hill 112. Epsom wound down on June 30th, with Commonwealth forces continuing to conduct operations north of Caen with Charnwood. No sooner had Charnwood ended than the British Second Army renewed its attacks to the west, designed to maintain pressure on the Panzer divisions. These missions then returned to the area west of Caen to cover Operation Jupiter, an offensive to take the high ground of Hill 112, with the 43rd Wessex Division taking the lead. From what I've read so far, it looks to be a shaping operation for Operation Goodwood, which was scheduled to coincide with the US Operation Cobra for the 18th. The primary elements of 43rd Division were 129th and 130th Brigades, with our mission focusing on 130th Brigade to the east. The concept of operation was in 3 phases. Phase 1, covered by missions 1 and 2, was assigned to 5th Dorsets, supported by B Squadron 9 Royal Tank Regiment. This would capture the area of Fontaine-Étoupefour, Château de Fontaine. Phase 2, covered by mission 3, was assigned to 4 Dorsets, supported by C Squadron 9 Royal Tank Regiment and a troop of crocodiles from A Squadron 141st Royal Armoured Corps. They were to capture and clear Etterville. Once the first 2 phases were completed, the third phase could be executed, with 7th Hampshires advancing through the centre of 130th Brigade, along with Churchill's of B Squadron 9 Royal Tank Regiment to secure Malto. Each phase, represented by the In the Shadows of the Hill scenarios, has a rough time outlined, so we're expecting to be fighting from 5 to 9 AM. And these all take part on sections of this larger master map. Now, I wanted to draw this out because to me it really shows how war seems to contract or dilate in scale. So remembering our bayonet strength, we're looking at around 108 men to a company, with each mission covering around 300 to 400 men on map, at the very tip of the spear. On the one hand, this seems like a very small portion of the forces in Normandy. Then on the other, we're again looking at hundreds of men and vehicles in an area covering a 1.6 by 4 kilometre area of operations. So from a tactical perspective, our massive infantry division breaks down like a Russian doll. The division is made up of 3 brigades, each composed of 3 battalions. 2 battalions are up, with 1 held in reserve, and this pattern of 2 up, 1 in reserve continues all the way down to section level. As a result, the initial wave of our attack only really consists of just over 250 men actively involved with the 2 forward companies. Now again, this is quite a dramatic position for them to be in at the head of an 18,000 strong infantry division. Looking more closely at the mission map, again with the phases and times, Scenario 1 will cover part of Phase 1 to take a wood line and a farm building north of Château de Fontaine. Scenario 2 will follow on with the assault on the chateau. Then Scenario 3 will move to Phase 2 with the attack on Etterville. Finally, Scenario 4 will cover the capture of Malto. Now, to avoid further butchering of the French pronunciations, I'm going to refer to the locations by their code names. So we have Horseshoe Wood, Château de Fontaine is referred to as Stroud, Etterville as Gloucester, Malto as Bath, and I'm naming Le Douin as Stonehouse in keeping with the Gloucestershire code names and as a descriptive for the expected farmhouse hardpoint. The first mission is a straightforward advance on objectives Stonehouse and Horseshoe Wood, eliminating the German salient and setting the stage for a continued push towards objective Stroud. Terrain between our starting point at Fontaine-Étoupefour and Stonehouse is gently sloping and largely open, offering no cover. So the problem facing our men is simple. We have the darkness of early morning on our side, and the wheat fields can provide some concealment, but our troops will be exposed and vulnerable during the assault. The enemy is also likely to be on alert, with our artillery firing barrages on Hill 112 ahead of our attack. I decided not to do anything fancy and planned to advance the infantry at a move pace along with the tanks, whilst my artillery focused on softening up the objectives. The briefing explains the distances and times, and I used these to plan 2 suppressing missions right up to the point that our infantry companies would hit their objectives. Artillery played a key part in the British Army of World War II, and I've even read one German officer comment, "The heavy Russian bombardment in the east had done nothing to prepare us for Tommies." Since 1940, the British Army had significantly expanded the Royal Artillery, and by 1944, this highly effective force had become a cornerstone of the forces, with artillerymen making up a substantial proportion of soldiers on the battlefield. The Royal Artillery command structure shadowed the wider operational force, with each infantry division having 3 artillery regiments, with 1 regiment assigned to every brigade. These regiments were further divided into 3 gun batteries supporting each infantry battalion. As a standard, each battalion had 8 guns and a dedicated forward observation officer. More widely, 43rd Wessex Division could call upon the firepower of 3rd and 8th Army Group Royal Artillery, equipped with 4.5 and 5.5 inch guns, and the Royal Navy Bombardment Force. This approach is largely rooted in the principle of firepower attrition, which can be viewed as one of the core elements of the 21st Army Group's strategy during the Normandy campaign. I recently read a book that explores these elements and related aspects, and it sheds some light on some of the combat mission scenarios we've already encountered. In certain instances, these factors are beyond our control, but they still have an indirect impact on us. For example, we're following a straightforward master plan from the brief. The idea of a master plan seems to be applied indiscriminately across campaign, operation, or sub-operational levels, and often gives the impression of being about a theatre strategy, achieved one operation at a time. Essentially, it involves ensuring that the battle or operation unfolds according to a predetermined pattern of action, planning the battle's conduct before it begins. This includes leveraging all available assets to steer the battle in the desired direction. Strict adherence to the master plan is crucial, and no one, especially not the enemy, should alter it. Rather than seizing the initiative, it's all about imposing your will on the battlefield. One of the real-world benefits of this approach is that everyone involved understands their role and how it contributes to the overall strategy. It also aims to maximise the potential of the force within its limitations. This approach is quite different from the mission analysis methodology employed by the modern professional British Army. Concentration can be understood as the deployment of overwhelming force, with fresh reserves ready to exploit opportunities. At the higher levels, this means that operations are only launched after thorough preparations. So again, this factor beyond our control is one we benefit from. It translates into massed firepower and manpower, which can also be seen as an advantage beyond our control from effective administration. Across the series of 4 missions, it also means we'll engage with fresh units in each encounter. This allows our attack on a narrow frontage to maintain momentum, with units rotating through objectives, ensuring that the assaulting force remains relatively fresh. At our level, it also involves maintenance of tidiness. We strive to control an orderly battle, ensuring concentration is sustained both before and during combat. Air power, grip, surprise and flexibility, as discussed in the book, are likely more relevant at the higher levels of command, or, in the case of air power, out of scope. There are, however, some elements within our control. For example, we can apply the concept of concentration and ensure our forces remain fresh. I implemented this later by having units rotate through each other, maintaining offensive momentum at a relatively steady tempo. Firepower attrition is also within our control. Our approach is to effectively blast our infantry onto the objectives, and we're again leaning into the barrage to try and reduce casualties, securing the objective. Caution is also applied in a methodical build-up to the fight, so our battle rhythm ends up something along the lines of concentration, start, stop, rebuild, start again. Then we have other elements, such as maintaining initiative and balance. This is about making the enemy dance to your tune from the outset, and a balanced force disposition that doesn't need to react to the enemy's moves is required. In simple terms, the commander must position his reserves effectively, ready to swiftly counter any anticipated enemy actions before they can achieve tactical success. By doing so, the enemy is forced to react rather than initiate their own plans. In this, balance refers to a commander's ability to deploy forces considering terrain, communications, and likely enemy responses so effectively that they can easily accommodate any counter-move rather than merely reacting to it. For the remaining elements, we're again looking at flank protection, which shows our strong respect for the German tactical capabilities, simplicity in the assigned tasks, combat lessons from previous missions, which I believe comes up more as we play through the series of missions, and once again cooperation, highlighting the same inter-arm infantry and armour issues. But now, as our barrage nears its end and we're about to crest the hill, we begin to encounter some of the limitations of this approach. For instance, firepower-based attrition can be mitigated by the depth of a defensive line. As we bump the enemy, we realise we're facing an untouched outpost line.
And my battalion's objective was to capture a chateau, and that was a battalion attack. It was brigade attack, 130 Brigade, which was my brigade, 2 battalions up, 4th Dorsetshire on our left, ourselves on the right, and 7th Hampshire's behind us.
Horseshoe Wood was on Hill 1-2, and Chateau de Fontaine was the building that we actually fought to take, I think, on Hill 1-2.
So on the 10th of July we mounted our first big attack, and we went over the top as they did at the start.
The shells were simply flying over our heads because we were putting down quite a tremendous barrage. And then the troops were advancing up this cornfield, and there were shots firing, and I can remember a German bloke up in the tree getting shot out of the tree.
So what was that like, your first action, was it?
Well, that was pretty grim there, yeah. It was pretty grim.
So you obviously saw a lot of people.
Oh yeah.
So that must have been quite hard, because you've been together a long time.
Oh yes, yeah.
So we must have lost at least 50 or 60 killed. And within 2 hours we'd lost every company commander except one, most of the platoon commanders, and some 200 casualties.
It was pretty hectic, and then they started bringing back prisoners of war, and some were only kids of about 14, 15 years of age, you know. Yeah, it's pretty horrible, that was.
In terms of what actually happened, this wasn't too dissimilar to what happened in real life. D Company took on Horseshoe Wood on the left, C Company the farm on the right. With C Company, I led off with 2 platoons and the reserve following slightly further behind than I would have liked because of German mortar fire. Initially, I bumped that outpost line just beyond the crest of the hill to the front of the objective. I then began to make spots on men in the farm buildings and in-depth positions along a hedgerow. My artillery had focused on the hardpoint buildings, so everything other than the farm force was relatively unharmed. The open terrain worked for me in some respects though. I could call on our platoon's mortars and tanks to more easily tackle in-depth positions, and once the reserves were brought up, I could make a flank across the right into the back line. I also shuffled some men left to a hedgerow where they could fire into the farm's courtyard. The advance towards Horseshoe Wood was similar with a heavy 2 platoons up approach and rushed the forward edge troops relatively easily. In-depth positions were, however, found deeper in the wood, along with a nasty reverse slope MG position. The artillery focused on the front edge made the break-in easy, but from there I struggled to bring tank or indirect fire on in-depth positions. Of the 2, the farmhouse seemed to take more casualties, but I didn't manage to clear the woods fully in the game time, so this could have been even harder. In real life, the defenders of 7th Company were stunned by the ferocity of the barrage, and the farm position fell with relative ease. The battle for Horseshoe Wood, on the other hand, proved to be considerably stiffer as the barrage concluded prematurely. This granted the Panzer Grenadiers crucial time to recover before D Company reached the woods. The wood was also part of the main defence, held by the forward positions of 5th Company. I think I got away with this due to the hints from the brief. I had the wood barrage last longer, taking into consideration the route times. So I got a draw. I managed to get the initial foothold, so I hold the northern end of the woods and the farm, though this comes up as contested due to error on my behalf for the capture zone. And from here we go into the proper attack onto objective Stroud. My thoughts at this point were 2 options. I could either be more aggressive, expecting to now smash through to the HQ and remnants of the SS Company, or more cautious, given how poorly the first mission's gone. The force for Mission 2 is the same 2 companies of 5th Dorsets plus some additional from the support company. As this isn't a campaign, the scenario has had to adjust to account for the expected losses of the first mission from real life. D Company is on our left in Horseshoe Wood, C Company is on the right, mostly south of the farm buildings, which themselves have become the Battalion HQ's forward position. B Squadron continues to support us, with tanks following up behind both lead infantry companies. And we now also have the Pioneer Platoon and Carrier Platoon, with additional ammunition and mobile fire support from the Bren carriers. Looking from the enemy's position, we're facing a chateau complex on a reverse slope with lots of open fields leading up to the position. Their left, mostly wheat field, is similar to the first scenario's terrain. The central approach is an exposed bare field, then the right is fields which are interspersed with hedgerows and trees, offering concealment and cover. This then leads into the ruined gatehouse of the Chateau de Fontaine. So again, open country leading into the close country of the complex itself. We don't have any information on the enemy's positions, but we can certainly chunk up the terrain into blocks, which can each be handled individually. I decided this mission would focus primarily on D Company, who would use the concealment to push through on the left, and then work their way along the back line until they can come into the actual chateau itself. I also had a couple of target reference points, so I've tried to place these in positions where they can either provide decent area fire, interconnected lines, the potential for quick point fire on identified positions, but the main purpose for these really is to provide a sweeping barrage which D Company can follow through behind. D Company itself comprises 14, 15 and 16 platoons, which are in reasonably good condition. 16 platoon is on the right edge facing onto the northern field of objective Stroud. I kept the sections whole with 2 up and 1 deeper in the wood as a reserve. 15 platoon is on the left looking in depth and onto the route the company will be taking into the chateau. They're broken down slightly with 3 assault sections on the right and their gun groups on the left to act as an accurate base of fire. Part of the reason for this was to act as a sort of counter to the high concentration of German machine guns, with 2 to each squad. Then 14 platoon is in the centre with a similar breakdown, but also a 2-man scout team. This is led by the most senior lance corporal I could find to give them a bit of a fighting chance. I actually start off the battle with C Company moving forward in a hunt to establish the enemy's forward outpost lines. This sticks with the 2-up approach, with 2 platoons up front and each of them having 2 sections forward. The right hand platoon is the first to make contact with a machine gun position that's at the bottom of the hill, so we begin returning fire whilst I move the platoon's mortar up to handle it. Meanwhile, on the left with D Company, our scouts make their dash forward and we quickly end up identifying enemy positions. So there was 3 ways I was taught to locate the enemy, and they were observation, so looking for them, fire, so firing into likely positions and seeing if they return fire, and then movement as a last resort, so you dash out and hope someone shoots at you. These all seem to work in combat mission, but as we see here, fire and movement seems to be the quickest way. So we end up with units being identified along the central hedgerows to the north of Objective Stroud, and also some in the ruins of the gatehouse. So what I have is 15 platoons gun blob begin suppressing this, whilst their assault sections move in behind 14 platoon, and then 14 platoon themselves are starting to move down that nearest hedgerow. So I was actually quite happy with how the massed Brens performed. It's probably a bit of a risk having them concentrated like this, but their accuracy plus the numbers certainly seem to act as a solid base of fire, and it makes it feel a bit fairer, seeing as the Germans seem to have 2 machine guns to every single squad. Now we've got a bit of an idea of the enemy's positions, we start moving those tanks to get far onto them, and we continue to move 14 platoon down the hedgerow in a sort of parallel firefight with the opposite hedgerow. Unfortunately, the scout section does hit a German dug-in position, and I believe they get wiped out. But following in from that, we put in a section attack, so that takes that position and clears it. Now, in the centre, we've moved the tank up to a position where it can fire straight down that opposite hedgerow, and that gives some nice suppressive fire onto it. But I think you just saw it fly past there. There is an AT gun that gets identified, and it knocks out that tank. But we still have D Company's 15 platoon, so that was the one that was on the right hand edge facing into the northern fields. They can still give some supporting fire onto the area. And then we move up a tank which starts doing a sort of berm drill, so this pops up, fires, reverses out. So again, focusing on the left hand push, we've got a troop of tanks moving in to support the infantry from D Company. In addition to this, we've got one of the close support tanks sort of on a T-junction that's firing across the front edge of German lines. And then as D Company's forming up for the push into the Chateau gatehouse, the tanks of B Squadron begin brassing up the area. What I was hoping for here was that their fire would keep up the pressure of the 25 pounders now that they'd shifted deeper into the complex, but with the greater accuracy direct fire. This takes a few turns, but I'm allowing it. So again, we're looking at the build up in that cycle of concentration, start, stop, start again. And on this map, you can see the weight that's building up on the eastern edge of Objective Stroud. And eventually what we've got is D Company in full, troop of Churchills, and the engineers. Over to our right, C Company is continuing with a very gradual probe, along with further 2 tanks pushing onto the northern meadow. At this point, we seem to have silenced that AT gun with artillery. Whilst there's still a risk of handheld anti-tank weapons, we're reasonably confident, so as long as they continue blasting into known enemy positions, I'm happy to move them forward. And once I'm happy D Company is ready, I'll give one last brief volley of cannon fire and begin the push into the gatehouse. 15 platoon leads this off, pushing through 14 platoon who are still reorganising, and they're quickly facing close combat fighting with perhaps a platoon of Germans, so pretty chaotic, lots of automatic and semi-automatic weapons. Then as this becomes more established, 14 platoon pushes to a line north of the gatehouse, creating an L shape, and 16 platoon pushes south to act as a cut-off. This time what we're facing is a bit more of a mix, so we've still got those determined die-in-a-ditch types who are exceptionally hard to root out, but we've also got amongst them less motivated types who break and run towards the rear of the chateau. On the left, C Company's been steadily moving forward. Here they've got some slightly easier section and platoon attacks against isolated machine guns. And these are a little bit more like the basic soldiering, where you're typically looking at least a 3-to-1 ratio. With 14 platoons supporting on the flank, 15 platoons sweeps through the gatehouse, mopping up positions, and the engineers are moved up to blast into some barns. The 25-pounder barrage has also been steadily firing and has swept to the rear of the chateau, where I've got some infantry and vehicle sound contacts. I'm assuming this is some kind of rear company area for the Germans, much like our carriers and support units, which are still up at Stonehouse. So I push 16 platoon over to attack. But then something tips the balance, and it triggers a surrender. The outcome's actually pretty good, so we've got 17 killed and 18 wounded, so that means a total of 71 killed, 74 wounded for the battalion's morning. And when you go back to see what we're up against, you find out it's about 2 understrength companies, or 1 reinforced one, depending on how you look at it. This is the same unit from the first mission, and what you've got is 5 company, so these are the guys who had been holding Horseshoe Wood, and they've been absorbed into 6 company. So if we're thinking about that, 2 up, 1 in reserve, what we're seeing here is the German reserve. And in terms of their casualties, you can see those left by 6 company at the gatehouse. These were as we were moving through there. We've also got some of 5 company. These seem to have been some of those who had been making that dash towards the back of the chateau. And then lastly, we've got the AT gun in the centre. So from its position, you can see the Churchill that we lost on the top of the ridge. And then this looks to have been abandoned as the artillery was sweeping through. On our side, I think D Company took the most losses. So 14 platoon is being led by the platoon sergeant, and the sections are down about 10 men, though we've managed to collect some of the casualties. 15 platoon is similar, so this is being led by a sergeant, and it's down some men. In both cases, what's happened here is a bit of a borrowing from battle drill, specifically the reorg, and what we've been using is Paces Do, which you can kind of use in combat mission to some extent. So Paces Do, that covers protection, ammunition, casualties, equipment, searches, dig in and deploy, or dig in or deploy, and orders. So for combat mission we can do a bit of this, and it's thinking about once we've taken a position, this is the counter-attack, collecting kit such as Brens and Piats off casualties, and generally reorganising. Then we've got 16 platoons, so this is the best off. They're the only platoon actually that hasn't had an officer casualty in D Company, and their sections are in pretty good strength. C Company is also in pretty good condition, so this only acted really in support. They've still lost some men though, so 1 platoon is being led by a sergeant again, and one of the sections is actually being led by a lance corporal. So what actually happened? Well, D Company had engaged in fierce close quarters fighting as they advanced through Horseshoe Wood. Lieutenant Colonel Code, the battalion commander, described the encounter as a costly affair, emphasising the intensity and brutality of the fighting. Among the casualties was the company commander, Major John Rowe, and Lieutenant Hayes, who had led his platoon too far forward and was believed to have been killed along with most of his men after the SS veterans allowed them to pass through before opening fire. Despite these losses, D Company's momentum carried them onto the enemy trenches, where they engaged in brutal hand-to-hand combat. After capturing Stonehouse, C Company advanced along the battalion's right flank, following the tanks towards their primary objective, Objective Stroud. And then in this area, the Great Barn near the chateau was serving as the German battalion's headquarters. So this was a formidable obstacle for the single company, with the complex being defended by the Grenadiers of 6 Company and heavy weapons of 8 Company. C Company was also unable to update the battalion headquarters on their progress due to their radio being badly damaged. Lieutenant Colonel Code eventually learned of the situation through a report from A Company, indicating that C Company was facing difficulties on the northern end of the objective. So breaking into the SS defences was costly and time-consuming, despite artillery firing in support to seal the chateau complex off from reinforcements. Once 5th Dorsets were in the heart of the enemy defences, clearing the chateau's buildings and barns absorbed the men. But the company continued to move slowly forward, and eventually they occupied the whole area. The Dorset's Advanced Battalion headquarters reported at 6:15 that they had taken Chateau de Fontaine. However, the Dorsets would soon discover that taking a position was not the same as clearing and securing it.